Wow. We want to get to the political ramifications of all of this in just a moment. But first, let's go to the legalities. We've got Jonathan Turley, Danny Cevallos, and Barbara McQuade. So we'll go through each of you. Jonathan Turley, I'll start with you. A scale of 1 to 10, how bad is this for the president, and what are the possibilities?
Well, it couldn't be worse. And I have to say, I'm not as convinced about this new morality play featuring Michael Cohen. This idea that he's suddenly been liberated in the sense that he's going to tell the truth. It really doesn't fit with the indictment. If you take a look at the first 6 counts, he's a felon. And he has a reputation in New York of being something of a thug. And so he's not that credible of a witness. I mean, if everything that was said yesterday is true, then most of the things he said for the entire year before were lies. And so that means that his use as a witness will require corroboration. But having said that, he just did implicate the president in a crime. The president is effectively an unindicted co-conspirator if you believe everything that was in this filing. Now, that makes this campaign finance case, which is a difficult thing usually to prosecute, stronger than the John Edwards case. They didn't have a Michael Cohen who would say, first, I knew I was committing a crime. Second, I did it at the behest of Donald Trump. And third, I'm willing to give evidence and details as to how we carried that out.
You know, I tend to agree. What he admits to is appalling, and this is something Barbara McQuade, he admits to these crimes over the course of years and years. Yet Michael Cohen is in deep. He's in big trouble. Can he save himself through this process? Is there something that he can give them to perhaps mitigate what he's facing now at this point? And what are you seeing as the possibilities?
Yeah, potentially, yes. You know, Emily reported yesterday that they just started talking with Michael Cohen and prosecutors last week. And so the first task is, let's get this plea done. And so the conversations, I'm sure, resulted in the culmination of that plea agreement yesterday. But it appears they have not yet had time to probe all of his knowledge of the 17-year relationship he's had with President Trump. And I imagine part of that reason is it wasn't until this Monday that the judge, the retired judge who's been serving as the special master, completed her privilege review of all of the items that were taken in the search of Michael Cohen's office. And so it's really not until the prosecutors have their arms around all those documents that they're able to confront him and probe his knowledge of all of those things. So my guess is now is the time that they'll sit down with him over a series of debriefings and talk about all those things that Lanny Davis has mentioned, including the president's knowledge of the hacking and encouragement of it. If he can deliver that kind of information and that can be corroborated, that could be really devastating for the president. And so I imagine that's going to come in the coming months. He really has until December, when his sentencing is scheduled, to provide all that information and get a reduction in that sentence range of 3.5 to 5 years. Could be all the way down to probation. He even has a year after that under a different statute to continue to provide information. So I think this is just the start of a cooperation relationship with Michael Cohen.
Mika, I have to jump in here. It's absolutely possible, and I warn people to not assume that just because Michael Cohen entered into a plea agreement without a cooperation agreement apparent from its face, he still may be presently cooperating, he may be planning to cooperate, and the critical piece of information is that he only recently started talking to prosecutors. Prosecutors need weeks, maybe even months to debrief a defendant like Michael Cohen or a cooperating witness before they decide that they're going to cooperate him, and they have to vet him to make sure that his story is accurate and truthful. Only then will they even consider granting that precious 5K1 motion, which offers almost unlimited level reduction in the ultimate sentence. So from this point forward, the prosecutors are very, very cautious purchasers of the testimony of Michael Cohen, and they might back out of the deal at any time if they decide he's not truthful and not give him the benefit of his bargain. So it's very important important to realize that he may be cooperating and he may cooperate in the future. It's absolutely true that defendants can cooperate even after sentencing under the rules. And it's also important to know that cooperation agreements are often not public. It's often is the case that even at sentencing, we will address the issue of a defendant's cooperation at sidebar, away from open court and away from the ears of anyone who might hear, because it's just too dangerous to an ongoing investigation and a cooperating witness to make these kinds of things public as a matter of routine.
Wow. We'll get to how history will look at this in just a moment. But first, the politics. Reporters shared insights into the thinking of those around President Trump. The New York Times' Michael Schmidt tweeted, when Cohen raid went down, it opened up a big second front in Trump's legal wars. Trump lawyers always feared it more than Mueller because they had no handle on his legal exposure, and they never thought they got straight answers from Trump on the extent of what he did with Cohen. John Roberts tweeted, source close to Donald Trump tells Fox News, remember, the president cannot be indicted. While Maggie Haberman added, Trump folks are worried about impeachment more than before. The thinking goes like this. This is something tangible, not theoretical, and it didn't come from Mueller. Does not mean it will happen, but this has moved to a different stage in their minds. And what about the minds of lawmakers on Capitol Hill? Casey Hunt, is their reaction? Are people going to finally step up, who we've been surprised to hear them so silent, given all the different stages of this presidency, when Republicans really could have come forward and said, you know what, no, this is wrong?
Mika, I almost hesitate to say this, but I did get a text yesterday evening from one member of Congress who simply called it a dumpster fire, a Republican who said that this is, kind of in some ways partially what they expected, but also beyond what anybody thought could happen in a single day, or even, I think it was the span of an hour, maybe an hour and a half that this news came out. There have always been in these kind of behind the scenes, never Trump circles that still do exist in Washington, this sense that, well, maybe the legal system would solve the Republican Party's Trump problem for them. Now we are so far past that. The Republican Party is inextricably linked to Donald Trump. They have essentially made their bed. The base of the party is with the president. They're not necessarily with these lawmakers, and that puts incredible pressure on Republican members of Congress. And I know, John Meacham has talked about this before as the historian in the room, but remember that what shifted the ground in Watergate was Republican voters who had turned against President Nixon, and that in turn put pressure on the Republican members of Congress who ultimately, were the ones that swung the process against the president. So Republicans in Congress still have an incredible amount of power, but it is not clear to me yet that they are going to exercise it in opposition to this president, and it's possible it may take even more than what we saw yesterday.
That will be fascinating to watch. It's so interesting, Elise Jordan, because the news last night seemed to swallow up Trump's rally. Of course, you'd want to cut to the rally to see what the president was saying in reaction to everything, but everything was so big that they kept cutting away. At least most of the networks I was watching kept cutting away from him because there was too much important news. And yet, though, Elise, what you see there are lots of Trump supporters shouting, hollering, cheering for him. And the question is, this is his base, will the base be moved?
Well, Mika, the short answer is no. It's very baked in as of now and is not going to change that Donald Trump is indeed a scumbag. Voters know that. They do not expect him to be the kind of man who treats his wife with any decency and dignity. And that is a known and isn't going to necessarily move the most hardcore voters. However, I would say that you have a lot of women voters who aren't exactly happy to have ever had to vote for Donald Trump in the first place. They just were not necessarily fans of Hillary Clinton, and while they might have voted for Donald Trump, this isn't the kind of behavior that makes them excited to keep supporting his party. And you look at the Republican Party, big picture, just how they have lost completely any credibility as a moral force for virtue as they continue to lie and deny that what Donald Trump has done is wrong. So as of now, it might just be political corruption. It might be campaign corruption. But you look at what there is to come and still looming, especially with Mike Flynn, and we still have no idea what Mike Flynn what he has to say, what he told Mueller's team in order to get such a great deal. There are so many unknowns that this is really just the tip of the iceberg.
John Meacham, at this stage in the presidency, what's the historical parallel? And you know what? If there isn't one, that's fine. But put this into context as to exactly how bad this day was for Donald Trump and this White House.
I think the closest parallel does go back to Watergate. It goes back to the summer of 1973 when the chain of events began unfolding that ultimately showed in the summer of 74 that Nixon had done something not unlike what President Trump is accused of by his own lawyer in the plea deal, which is Nixon was on tape orchestrating a cover-up using federal agencies to block one another to try to keep the heat away from his own White House's political espionage arm. And ultimately, what broke the Nixon presidency, and this is important, I think, is a combination really of three things. One was his own lawyer turned on him. Sound familiar? John W. Dean, the White House counsel. Secondly, the revelation of more evidence than one could possibly have imagined, which was Alexander Butterfield revealing that Nixon had, in one of the most colossally stupid maneuvers in human history, had taped himself. Which is, besides that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? I mean, it's just that Richard Nixon would tape himself. And we just don't know in Trump world what possible evidence there could be, that whether it's tapes or memos or testimony, we just don't know. And third was the fact that he actually was, in fact, guilty. And there was a common sense recognition of this after the Supreme Court ruled in late July of 1974 that he had to hand over the tapes, and then he was gone within about 2 weeks. Here's one of the questions that sort of brings the political and the legal together, and we don't know the answer to this. There is the legal process and an open question about whether a sitting president can be indicted and tried. There's opinion on it, but it's very mixed. The Supreme Court has never ruled on this. The politics of impeachment is very much about that. From Andrew Johnson to Bill Clinton to Nixon, the nature of impeachment is that a high crime and misdemeanor is really whatever a majority of the House decides it is at any given moment. It's a phrase of Gerald Ford's. So that impeachment is a different thing than the indictment question. My own bet, and Jonathan and the others would know better, is that the question of whether you can indict a sitting president seems to me to be a matter that the Supreme Court may have to rule on before this drama enters its fifth act.
All right, we need to get Jonathan Turley on that, and we will right after the break. And we haven't even gotten to Paul Manafort. Everyone stay with us. Still ahead on Morning Joe, as one Trump associate admitted his guilt, another was judged for his. Paul Manafort was convicted by a jury of his peers for bank and tax fraud. We'll run through that case and get to all the political implications on Capitol Hill. You are watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.